Honestly, Ethan, look at her. She stands out like a cheap wine stain on vintage lace. You can drag a girl out of the gutter, but you simply cannot scrub off the failure. She is incompatible with the Whitman legacy. As the cruel, sophisticated laughter of her husband's family filled the ballroom, Makayla stood frozen, watching Ethan turn his back on her to save his own face. They thought they had crushed her spirit forever. They were wrong. 2 years later, Makayla returned to that same gala, not to beg for a seat, but to show them exactly what a failure looks like when she arrives in a limousine of her own. But could you forgive a husband who watched you fall, or would you leave him behind in the dust? Let us know your choice in the comments, and subscribe to see how Makayla claims her empire. The air inside the Whitmore estate did not circulate so much as it hovered, heavy with the scent of expensive Casablanca lilies and the crushing weight of generational expectations. Makayla Bennett Whitman stepped across the marble threshold, the click of her heels echoing against the vaulted ceiling like a gunshot in a library. To anyone else, the gala was a celebration of legacy, but to Makayla, it felt like entering a gladiatorial arena armed only with her dignity. She had chosen her armor carefully for tonight, eschewing the safe pastel chiffons that the Whitman women wore like uniforms. Instead, she wore a dress of structural midnight black silk, designed by Amia, a rising artist from her own community in Brooklyn. The fabric held a raw, organic texture that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, a bold slash of darkness amidst a sea of cream and champagne. As she moved deeper into the ballroom, the ambient chatter seemed to dip in volume, replaced by a ripple of whispers that felt less like curiosity and more like a collective judgment. Ethan, her husband, was technically by her side, yet he felt miles away. His hand held hers with a limp, clammy grip, his eyes darting around the room to scan for potential investors, rather than checking on his wife's comfort. The crystal chandeliers overhead cast a fracturing light that seemed to dissect Makayla, exposing every difference between her and the bloodline she had married into. She kept her chin high, anchoring herself in the belief that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. But that confidence began to fracture when Margaret Whitman materialized from the crowd. Her mother-in-law was standing by an elaborate floral centerpiece, her manicured fingers pinching a slightly wilted petal on a white lily. With a sharp, merciless snap, Margaret severed the imperfection and let it fall to the floor, her eyes never leaving Makayla's face. It was a silent declaration of her philosophy. Anything that did not meet the standard of perfection was to be discarded. Margaret glided toward them, the crowd parting like water for a shark. She did not look Makayla in the eye. Instead, her gaze drifted over Makayla's shoulder, scanning the room for more important guests, even as she invaded Makayla's personal space. With a smile that didn't reach her frozen blue eyes, Margaret raised a hand, her diamond ring catching the light, and brushed a non-existent speck of dust from Makayla's shoulder. It was a gesture of dismissal, masquerading as intimacy. "Raw silk?" Margaret asked, her voice dropping to a register that was soft yet carried the cutting edge of a razor. A brave choice, Makayla. Most women in this circle know that if one wishes to shine, one shouldn't try to scream for attention with their outfit. But I suppose that is how people garner attention where you grew up. The insult landed with precision, targeting Makayla's origins and her taste in one breath. Makayla felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced her facial muscles into a rigid, polite smile, refusing to give Margaret the satisfaction of a visible wound. "This is a design by Amia, a rising artist of color, mother," Makayla replied, her voice steady despite the rapid thrumming of her heart. "I believe that innovation is also a form of beauty." Margaret let out a short, airless laugh and finally turned her back, casting a glance over her shoulder as she walked away. "Innovation? In this family, Makayla, we call that the rebellion of the uneducated." The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy, leaving Makayla feeling stripped bare. She squeezed Ethan's hand, desperate for a squeeze back, a sign of solidarity, but he was already looking toward the bar, oblivious or willfully ignorant of the verbal assault his wife had just endured. The isolation was suffocating. Makayla took a flute of champagne from a passing tray, her hands trembling slightly, needing something to do with them. She tried to blend in, to shrink, but the universe seemed determined to conspire against her. As she turned to avoid the pitying gaze of a cousin, a waiter, jostled by a boisterous group of young heirs, stumbled. It happened in slow motion. The tray tipped, and a glass of heavy Cabernet Sauvignon cascaded down the front of Makayla's dress. The cold liquid soaked instantly into the raw silk, turning the midnight fabric into a heavy, clinging mess. The sound of the glass shattering against the marble floor silenced the immediate vicinity. For a heartbeat, there was absolute stillness. Then the giggles started. It wasn't a roar of laughter, but something worse, a sophisticated, muffled tittering hidden behind gloved hands and cocktail napkins. Makayla stood frozen, the wetness seeping through to her skin, feeling the eyes of the room burrowing into her. She looked at Ethan, panic flaring in her chest, pleading silently for him to step in, to offer his jacket, to whisk her away with a comforting word. "Ethan," she stammered, reaching out, "please, can you get me a napkin or—" Ethan flinched away from her outstretched hand. He was looking past her, his eyes locking onto Mr. Henderson, the firm's biggest client, who was watching the scene with raised eyebrows. Panic flashed across Ethan's face, not for his wife's humiliation, but for the disruption of his carefully curated image. He stepped closer, not to comfort her, but to hiss through clenched teeth, his voice dripping with irritation. "Shh! Don't make a scene, Makayla. Mr. Henderson is looking right at us." He adjusted his cufflinks, creating a physical distance between them. You need to go to the bathroom and deal with this. Just go. Don't stand there like a stain in the middle of the ballroom." The word stain hit Makayla harder than the wine ever could. She looked at the man she had married, seeing him clearly for the first time. He wasn't embarrassed for her. He was embarrassed by her. To him, she was no longer his wife, but a blemish on the pristine surface of the Whitman legacy. The room blurred around her, the glittering chandeliers turning into mocking eyes. Clinging to the last shreds of her dignity, Makayla turned and walked alone toward the exit. The click of her heels now sounding less like a gunshot and more like the ticking clock of a life falling apart, leaving her completely and utterly alone in a room full of people. The crimson stain on Makayla's dress was still damp, clinging to her skin like a cold, wet brand of shame when the house lights dimmed. She had been inching toward the exit, desperate for the sanctuary of the powder room or perhaps the freedom of the street, but the heavy oak doors felt miles away. Before she could take another step into the shadows, a beam of harsh, white light cut through the gloom and pinned her to the spot. The voice of Beatrice Whitman, Ethan's older sister, rang out through the speakers, sickly sweet and sharp as a scalpel. Beatrice stood on the raised platform at the front of the ballroom, holding a microphone with both hands, her head tilted at a precise 45-degree angle that suggested innocence, while her eyes gleamed with predatory intent. She was the family's designated executioner, the one who delivered the blows Margaret deemed too messy for her own hands. Beatrice summoned Makayla to the stage not with a request, but with a command masked as a familial invitation, leaving Makayla no choice but to ascend the steps. To refuse would be to cause the scene Ethan so desperately feared. To comply was to walk voluntarily to the gallows. As Makayla stepped onto the platform, the heat of the spotlights hit her physically, blinding her to the audience below. She was acutely aware of the wine stain, which surely looked like a gaping wound under the unforgiving illumination. Beatrice smiled, a tightening of facial muscles that didn't reach her eyes, and adjusted the microphone stand. With a subtle, calculated movement, she raised it 3 inches too high, forcing Makayla to stretch awkwardly, stripping away her posture and elegance before she had even uttered a word. Beatrice leaned in, her voice amplified to reach every corner of the cavernous hall, dripping with condescending honey. "Everyone loves a Cinderella story, don't they?" she began, pausing for the ripple of knowing laughter that moved through the crowd. "Makayla, dear, why don't you share with our esteemed investors and family? What does it feel like to finally step into a room where the ceiling doesn't leak? It must be simply overwhelming for you, isn't it?" The question hung in the air, a poisonous vapor. It was designed to remind everyone that Makayla was an outsider, a charity case, a girl from a world of leaking roofs and broken things. Down in the darkness, the laughter wasn't raucous. It was a sophisticated, jagged sound, a chorus of titters and snickers that felt like stones being thrown. Makayla looked out into the void, her eyes adjusting just enough to see the front row. She saw Margaret, watching with the impassive, satisfied mask. She looked for Ethan, desperate for him to stand up, to shout, to do anything. Instead, she found him near the bar, his head bowed, swirling the ice in his whiskey glass, studying the amber liquid as if the secrets of the universe were drowning in it. He was not coming to save her. The realization hit Makayla with the force of a physical blow. She was entirely alone. Her hands gripped the cold metal of the microphone stand, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. Her heart hammered against her ribs, threatening to crack them open. For a second, the urge to run was overwhelming, to flee the stage and the house and the marriage. But as the laughter continued, something inside the humiliation hardened. The shame that had been threatening to drown her suddenly crystallized into a cold, sharp anger. She looked at Beatrice, who was waiting with a smirk for Makayla to stammer a grateful, incoherent reply. Makayla took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of expensive perfume and old money, and when she exhaled, she released the fear. She leaned into the microphone, refusing to stand on her tiptoes to meet it, instead tilting it down to her level with a decisive scrape of metal against metal. "The overwhelming feeling doesn't come from high ceilings, Beatrice," Makayla said. Her voice wavered on the first syllable but found its steel by the second, ringing out clear and undeniable over the murmuring crowd. "It comes from realizing that sometimes the most palatial homes hold the coldest hearts." The silence that followed was instantaneous and absolute. It was as if she had sucked the oxygen out of the room. Beatrice's smile faltered, her lips parting in shock as the insult registered. The crowd, expecting a submission, had received a slap. Makayla didn't retreat. She held her ground, her chin high, staring into the abyss of wealthy faces. In that suspended moment, while the Whitmans stood frozen in their offense, Makayla's gaze drifted to the far left of the room. There, standing apart from the clusters of gossipers, was a man she recognized from the business journals, Thomas Lane. He was not laughing. He was not whispering. He stood still as a statue, holding a glass of scotch he hadn't touched all night. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, like those of a hawk spotting prey, were locked onto hers. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his glass in her direction. It wasn't a toast of celebration, but of recognition. He had seen the steel beneath the silk. Makayla lowered the microphone and stepped back, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving her limbs trembling. She walked off the stage not with the hurried pace of a victim fleeing a crime scene, but with the measured gait of a survivor leaving a battlefield. The path to the exit cleared for her, guests parting not out of respect, but out of a sudden, uncomfortable wariness. She caught Ethan's eye as she passed the bar. He looked up, pale and wide-eyed, the fear of his mother radiating off him in waves. He opened his mouth as if to speak, perhaps to offer a ride or a pathetic apology. But Makayla didn't break stride. She pushed through the heavy double doors and into the cool night air, the silence of the estate garden wrapping around her. She was shivering, the wine stain cold against her skin, but the suffocating weight of the gala was gone. She had burned a bridge tonight. She knew that. The Whitmans would never forgive her for speaking the truth. But as she looked up at the indifferent stars above the New York skyline, she realized she didn't want their forgiveness. She wanted to build a roof of her own, one that didn't leak and one that didn't require her to shrink to fit inside. The war had begun, and for the first time, Makayla felt ready to fight. The silence inside the apartment was a different kind of heavy than the silence at the gala. It was the hollow, echoing quiet of a space shared by two people who had stopped speaking the same language. Makayla Bennett Whitman stood before the bathroom mirror, the harsh vanity lights illuminating the remnants of the evening's disaster. She picked up a cotton pad soaked in makeup remover and pressed it against her skin, scrubbing hard, as if she could erase not just the foundation and contouring, but the memory of Margaret's condescending touch and the sticky, cold sensation of wine soaking through silk. The black dress, now ruined and stiff with dried Cabernet, lay in a heap on the tiled floor like a shed skin. As she wiped away the layers of polish required to be a Whitman wife, Makayla looked at her reflection. Her eyes were red-rimmed, not from tears but from the strain of holding them back for hours. The woman looking back at her was exhausted, stripped of her armor, and utterly done with pretending. She didn't want to repair the crack in the crystal glass. She wanted to smash the glass entirely and build something unbreakable from the shards. The next morning, the pristine, quiet streets of the Upper East Side felt suffocating, so Makayla took a cab across the bridge to Brooklyn. The atmosphere shifted the moment the skyline changed. The air here smelled of exhaust, roasting coffee, and urgency. She found herself standing in front of a weathered brick building with a faded sign that read, Simmons Architecture and Community Planning. Inside, the space was a chaotic assault on the senses, the polar opposite of the Whitman estate. It smelled of sawdust, old paper, and strong, cheap coffee. Blueprints were piled in precarious towers, and the lighting was warm, yellow, and unforgiving of dust motes dancing in the air. In the center of the room, a woman with graying dreadlocks pulled back in a severe bun was wrestling with a broken wooden chair, her hands covered in wood glue and grime. Clara Simmons didn't look up when the door chimed. She was a legend in urban planning, known for her brilliant designs and her absolute refusal to cater to the whims of wealthy developers. "We're closed for solicitations," Clara barked, her focus entirely on the chair legs she was clamping. Makayla stepped over a box of tiles, her presence out of place in her tailored coat. "I'm not selling anything," Makayla said, her voice steady. "I need a mentor. I have an idea for a housing project, and I was told you're the only one who builds with a conscience." Clara finally looked up, her eyes narrowing behind thick-rimmed glasses as she assessed the expensive coat and the determined set of Makayla's jaw. She snorted, returning to her work. "If you came to cry about your rich in-laws, the tissue box is by the door, and my consulting fee is $200 an hour. But if you want to build something that makes them shut their mouths, then pick up that hammer over there." The bluntness of the invitation was like a splash of cold water. Makayla blinked, then walked over to the workbench and gripped the heavy wooden handle of the hammer. It felt solid, real, and dangerous. "I don't know where to start," Makayla admitted, the weight of the tool grounding her. "They called me a failure. They looked at me like I was a mistake." Clara slammed a ruler down on the table, the sharp crack making Makayla jump. "Whatever they say is irrelevant," Clara snapped, her voice rough with impatience. "What matters is what you build. Dignity isn't something people hand to you on a silver platter at a buffet, Makayla. Dignity is something you have to nail and mortar yourself. Now look at these plans. Tell me where the structural weakness is." For the next 4 hours, there was no talk of galas or wine stains. There was only load-bearing walls, community integration, and the raw mechanics of creation. When Makayla returned to the apartment that evening, the sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the living room floor. She felt tired in her bones, but her mind was electric, buzzing with the concepts Clara had forced her to confront. She placed the registration papers for the community design workshop on the kitchen island and poured a glass of water. The front door opened, and Ethan walked in. He looked haggard, his tie loosened, the stress of the previous night still etched into his forehead. He spotted the papers immediately. He picked them up, scanning the bold text, and his face crumbled into a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "What the hell is this?" Ethan asked, waving the paper in the air. "A community design workshop? In Brooklyn?" He tossed the paper back onto the counter as if it were contaminated. "Makayla, Mother is already furious about your little speech on stage. She's been calling me all day. And now you're planning to go play construction worker? You have a comfortable life here. Why do you have to try so hard to prove something? You're just going to embarrass us further." Makayla set her glass down with a deliberate soft click. She turned to face him, leaning her hip against the counter, crossing her arms not in defense, but in judgment. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the fear that governed his entire existence. He wasn't malicious, he was just small. "I'm doing this because of what happened in that ballroom, Ethan," she said, her voice calm and devoid of the pleading tone she used to use with him. "We talked about this," Ethan interrupted, running a hand through his hair. "It was a mistake. I panicked." "No," Makayla cut him off, her eyes locking onto his. In that room, Ethan, when everyone was laughing, you let go of my hand. You turned your back. She picked up the registration paper, smoothing out the crease he had made. I'm not building this to prove anything to your mother or your sister. I'm not building it for you. I'm building it to ensure that the next time I fall, there will be a foundation to catch me, rather than your silence. She walked past him, heading toward the bedroom to pack a bag for the workshop, leaving him standing alone in the expensive, silent kitchen, holding nothing but the empty air where her respect for him used to be. The cacophony of the construction site in East New York was a violent, beautiful symphony that stood in stark contrast to the hushed, sterile atmosphere of the Whitmore estate, replacing the polite clinking of silverware with the guttural roar of jackhammers and the rhythmic shouting of foremen. Makayla Bennett Whitman stood in the center of the chaos, her boots coated in gray dust and her hair tucked beneath a white hard hat, consulting a set of blueprints that fluttered in the gritty wind. She was no longer the decorative wife standing silently in a ballroom. Here, amidst the exposed rebar and pouring concrete of the Horizon of Hope project, she was the architect of her own salvation. The project had begun as a desperate sketch on a napkin, but under the tutelage of Clara Simmons, it had metamorphosed into a radical initiative to transform abandoned warehouses into safe, community-centric housing for displaced families. Makayla had made a controversial decision to hire exclusively from the demographic she aimed to serve: women who had been domestic violence survivors, the long-term unemployed, and those whom society, much like her mother-in-law, had deemed unsalvageable. The site was vibrating with an energy that was almost palpable, a mixture of anxiety and fierce determination, as the women learned trades that had been previously barred to them, welding steel and framing walls with a hunger that professionals often lost. It was into this swirl of dust and industry that Thomas Lane stepped, his polished Italian leather shoes looking absurdly out of place against the mud-caked ground. He navigated the debris with the casual arrogance of a man who owned the ground he walked on, his sharp eyes dissecting the operation not for its charitable intent, but for its structural viability. Makayla watched him approach, suppressing the urge to wipe the grime from her hands. Deciding instead that the dirt was a badge of honor she refused to hide. Lane stopped a few feet away, watching a team of women hoist a support beam into place, his expression unreadable until he turned his gaze to Makayla. Empathy is a nice story on paper, Mrs. Whitman, and it certainly plays well with the liberal press, Lane began, his voice cutting through the mechanical noise with practiced ease. But profit and scalability are the only languages I understand. And right now, this looks like a very expensive therapy session. Don't sell me tears. Sell me scale. Makayla met his gaze without flinching, her pulse steady despite the immense stakes of this conversation, for she knew that without his capital, the project would stall within the month. She gestured broadly to the women working around them, not as objects of pity, but as a formidable engine of production. I am not selling tears, Mr. Lane, she replied, her voice hard and resonant, carrying over the whine of a circular saw. I am selling stability to a neglected workforce that the market has underestimated. These women are building the homes they will live in, which means the build quality is higher and the turnover will be non-existent. I am selling stability, and that stability breeds a loyalty that your money cannot buy on Wall Street. Lane paused, a flicker of genuine intrigue breaking through his corporate mask as he looked from the workers back to the woman who led them. He was a shark, but sharks respected blood in the water, and Makayla was proving she could hunt. Fine, he said, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips as he extended a hand that Makayla shook firmly. Double the scale in 3 months. If you can prove this model works across 2 boroughs instead of just 1 block, I will write the check. The adrenaline of that handshake carried Makayla through the rest of the grueling day, but it evaporated the moment she unlocked the door to her Upper East Side apartment that evening. The air inside was stale, recycled, and thick with a tension that felt like ozone before a storm. Ethan was pacing the living room, his tie undone, and a glass of scotch already empty on the coaster, looking less like a husband and more like a cornered animal. He didn't ask her about her day or the dust on her clothes. He simply stopped pacing and looked at her with eyes wide with panic and accusation. "Mother just pulled the capital from my venture," Ethan blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in his haste to assign blame. "She called the bank an hour ago. She said as long as my wife is playing social activist and embarrassing the family with these gritty little projects, I am cut off. Do you understand what that means, Makayla? My liquidity is gone." He took a step toward her, his voice rising to a pitch that bordered on hysterical. "You have to stop, Makayla. Immediately, call Lane, call the contractors, and shut it down. Apologize to Mother so I can get my funding back." Makayla stood by the kitchen island, placing her heavy bag down with a thud that sounded like a gavel striking a sounding block. She looked at Ethan, seeing the man she had once thought was her partner, now revealed as nothing more than a hostage to his mother's purse strings. The contrast between the women she had worked with all day, women who had nothing but were building everything, and her husband, who had everything but could build nothing, was heartbreakingly stark. She didn't feel anger anymore. She felt a cold, clarifying distance. "You are being cut off because you live on your mother's money, Ethan," Makayla said, her voice quiet but lethal in the silence of the luxury apartment. She began to unbutton her work coat, revealing the dust that had settled into the fibers of her clothes, a stark difference to his pristine, albeit rumpled suit. "You have spent your life waiting for permission to exist, and me? I am earning money with my own hands, building something that belongs to me, not the Whitman estate." She walked past him, her shoulder brushing against his arm, and she felt him shrink away, not from the dirt, but from the power radiating off her. She turned back one last time, her eyes dry and fierce. "I will not shut it down. If you are afraid of the dark when your mother turns off the lights, Ethan, then stand aside, because I am busy building my own son." 2 years had passed since the wine had stained the floor of the Whitmore estate, a stain that had been scrubbed away by cleaners but burned permanently into Makayla's memory. Tonight the estate looked exactly the same, adorned with the same suffocating lilies and populated by the same people who measured worth in bloodlines and bank balances. The occasion was the 55th anniversary gala of the Whitman dynasty, an event designed to project an image of timeless stability. However, the atmosphere outside the grand entrance shifted perceptibly when a vehicle turned into the driveway that did not belong to the fleet of generic town cars or vintage Rolls-Royces usually parading through the gates. It was a sleek, obsidian limousine, longer and more imposing than anything else in the line, and emblazoned on the side in tasteful, luminescent silver script was the logo, Horizon of Hope. The murmur among the paparazzi and arriving guests began immediately, a low-frequency hum of recognition and curiosity. Makayla Bennett Whitman did not wait for a valet to open her door. The door swung open, and Makayla stepped out, not as the sacrificial lamb in raw black silk she had been 2 years ago, but as a conqueror clad in a sharply tailored white suit that seemed to absorb the flashbulbs rather than reflect them. She looked like a modern specter of justice, her hair styled in a regal, unapologetic afro that framed a face devoid of fear. She reached back into the car and gently guided a small hand into the light. Aaliyah, now 3 years old and dressed in a miniature version of her mother's confidence, stepped onto the red carpet, her eyes wide but her grip on Makayla's hand firm. This was the statement Makayla had come to make. She was not just a wife, she was a matriarch of her own making, and she had brought her legacy with her. Ethan was somewhere inside, likely nursing a drink in his bruised ego, but Makayla didn't need him to walk this path. She moved toward the entrance with a gravitational pull that drew every camera lens, her presence commanding a respect that had been laughably absent the last time she walked these stones. Waiting near the entrance, sensing the shift in the media's attention, was Margaret Whitman. The matriarch's internal radar for publicity was impeccable, and seeing the flashbulbs popping for her daughter-in-law, she immediately adjusted her mask. Margaret rushed forward, her chiffon gown billowing, arms outstretched in a performance of familial warmth that would have been convincing to anyone who didn't know the venom beneath. "Oh, my darling granddaughter," Margaret trilled, her voice pitching high enough to be caught by the microphones. "And Makayla, you are late, but we forgive you. Come here quickly, the photographers are waiting. We need a perfect family picture for the morning papers. Margaret reached out, her manicured claws aiming for Aaliyah's shoulder, intending to pull the child into a prop-like embrace that would suggest a unity that did not exist. Makayla moved with the speed and precision of a viper. She stepped between Margaret and Aaliyah, her body forming an impenetrable shield. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply caught Margaret's gaze and held it with a cold, terrifying serenity. "I am sorry, Margaret," Makayla said, her voice smooth enough to sound polite to the onlookers, but laced with iron. "The family picture will have to wait. Aaliyah is not accustomed to being touched by strangers." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and absolute. Margaret froze, her smile faltering for the first time as genuine shock cracked her porcelain facade. "Strangers?" Margaret whispered, the indignation rising in her throat. "I am her grandmother." Makayla leaned in, invading Margaret's personal space just as Margaret had done to her 2 years prior, and delivered the coup de grace in a whisper that was meant only for them. "A grandmother is the person who is there when you fall, Margaret. You? You are just the person who is there when there is a camera." Leaving Margaret stunned and speechless in the foyer, Makayla took Aaliyah's hand and swept into the ballroom. The hush that fell over the room was instant. Beatrice, who had been holding court near the stage, went silent. Makayla didn't skulk to the edges of the room this time. She walked directly to the stage, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea. The organizer, recognizing the shift in power and perhaps fearing to offend the woman who had recently been featured on the cover of Forbes as a visionary of urban renewal, handed her the microphone without a word. The sound system was perfect tonight. Makayla stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces that had once laughed at her. She saw Ethan in the back, looking small and pale. She saw Thomas Lane in the front row, nodding slowly, a silent partner in her ascent. "2 years ago," Makayla began, her voice resonating off the vaulted ceiling she had once been mocked for, "I stood on this stage and was asked a question. I was asked what it felt like to step into a room where the roof didn't leak." She paused, letting the memory of that humiliation ripple through the audience, making them uncomfortable in their finery. "Tonight, I stand here to answer that question properly. It feels like nothing compared to the feeling of handing a set of keys to a mother who has never held a lease in her name. Today, Horizon of Hope has built 500 roofs, roofs that do not leak, for women who were discarded by society. I realized something on my journey back here." She looked directly at Margaret, who had just entered the room, pale and shaken. "I do not need the approval of this room to know my worth. My value is not found in the invitations I receive or the champagne I drink. My value lies in the keys I hand out, in the foundations I pour, and in the fact that I built my own empire while you were busy polishing the gates of yours." The silence was shattered not by polite applause, but by a thunderous ovation led by the investors and business tycoons in the room, men and women like Thomas Lane, who respected power and results above pedigree. The Whitman family stood frozen, islands of irrelevance in a sea of adoration, directed at the woman they had tried to break. Margaret, desperate to regain control of the narrative, stepped forward as Makayla descended the stairs, forcing a smile and opening her mouth to perhaps suggest a donation or a partnership. But Makayla didn't stop. She turned slightly, gesturing to the man standing beside her. "Margaret," Makayla said dismissively, "I believe you know my senior investing partner, Thomas Lane. We were just discussing the expansion of the foundation, and unfortunately, we have no vacancies for honorary ambassadors." With a dazzling smile that didn't reach her eyes, Makayla turned her back on the Whitman matriarch, positioning herself so that when the photographers finally snapped the picture of the night, Margaret was nothing more than a blurred figure in the background of Makayla's triumph. The ink on the contract was still wet, glistening under the subdued lighting of the VIP lounge like a promise finally kept. As Makayla Bennett Whitman capped her fountain pen with a decisive click that echoed in the quiet room. Thomas Lane sat across from her, not with the predatory gaze of a shark scenting blood, but with the settled, respectful posture of a general acknowledging a fellow commander. They had just finalized the expansion of Horizon of Hope into 3 new major cities, a deal that would transform her local initiative into a national movement. And as Makayla slid the leather-bound folder across the mahogany table, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was carrying. She stood up, smoothing the lapels of her white suit, and declined Lane's offer of a celebratory drink, knowing that her real celebration would not be found in the bottom of a crystal glass, but in the freedom waiting for her outside these walls. She walked out of the lounge and through the back corridors of the estate, bypassing the lingering party guests who were still dissecting her speech like scavengers, and stepped out into the cool, crisp air of the night. The driveway was quieter now, the frenzy of the paparazzi having died down to a few lingering photographers packing away their gear, leaving the night to the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of the city. Makayla signaled to her driver, who stood by the open door of the obsidian limousine, but before she could step inside, the sound of hurried footsteps crunching against the gravel broke the rhythm of her exit. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The chaotic, breathless cadence of the approach belonged to a man who had spent his entire life running to catch up with expectations he could never meet. Ethan stopped a few feet away from her, his chest heaving slightly, his tuxedo tie askew and his hair ruffled by the wind, looking like a ghost of the polished aristocrat she had married. He looked at the limousine, then at the confident, statuesque form of his wife, and for the first time in years, the fog of his mother's influence seemed to clear from his eyes, replaced by a raw, terrified clarity. "Makayla, wait," Ethan stammered, taking a step forward but stopping when he saw the subtle shift in her posture, a warning that he was entering a space he no longer owned. I didn't know. I honestly didn't know you had done all of this. I listened to your speech, and I looked at Mother, and I realized she was wrong. I was wrong." He gestured helplessly toward the line of cars, his voice dropping to a plea that was heartbreaking in its sincerity. "Let me drive you home. Please, let me drive you and Aliyah back to the city. We can talk. We can start over tonight, just the three of us." Makayla turned fully to face him, the moonlight catching the sharp angles of her face, illuminating an expression that was not angry, but profoundly distant, like a mountain looking down at a valley. She looked at the car keys trembling in his hand, a symbol of the control he thought he could reassert, and she shook her head slowly, a motion that carried more finality than a shout. "You don't need to drive me anymore, Ethan," she said, her voice soft but carrying the unyielding weight of truth. "I have been holding the steering wheel of my own life since the night you turned your back on me in that ballroom 2 years ago. I learned to navigate the roads you were too afraid to travel, and I did it without a map from your family." Ethan flinched as if struck, his hand lowering slowly to his side. "So, what does that mean?" he asked, his voice cracking. "What are we? Are you leaving me?" "We are Aliyah's parents, Ethan, and that is a bond that is permanent," Makayla replied, stepping closer but maintaining a barrier of emotional airspace that he could not cross. "But as for us, the dynamic has changed. If you want to be part of this life, you need to understand one thing. From this moment on, you must learn to walk beside me. I do not need you standing in front of me to protect me, because I can protect myself, and I will certainly not tolerate you hiding behind me or your mother. You walk beside me as an equal, or you do not walk with me at all." She didn't wait for his answer, knowing that he would need time to deconstruct the lifetime of conditioning that had led him here. She turned and slid into the back of the limousine, the heavy door closing with a solid, satisfying thud that sealed out the confusion of the Whitman estate. Inside the car, the atmosphere was serene, a cocoon of soft leather and ambient light. Aliyah was sitting by the window, clutching a small gift bag from the party, her legs swinging rhythmically. She looked up as Makayla settled into the seat, her large, innocent eyes reflecting the passing lights of the driveway as the car began to move. The child had been quiet during the confrontation outside, observing with the intuitive radar that children possess, and now she turned her gaze to her mother. "Mommy," Aliyah said, her voice small in the quiet cabin, "Grandma looked really scary tonight when she tried to hug me. And why did all those people clap for you so loud? Was it because your suit was so white and pretty?" Makayla smiled, a genuine, warm expression that melted the Ice Queen persona she had worn for the gala. She reached out and pulled her daughter into a hug, inhaling the scent of baby shampoo and innocence. grounding herself in the only reality that truly mattered. She smoothed Aaliyah's hair, looking out the tinted window as the imposing iron gates of the Whitmore estate receded into the distance, becoming nothing more than a part of the landscape they were leaving behind. "No, baby, they didn't clap because of the suit," Makayla said gently, tilting Aaliyah's chin up so their eyes met. "They clapped because Mommy didn't let anyone turn off her light. You see, some people will try to dim you to make themselves feel brighter. But tonight, I showed them that I keep my own switch." Aaliyah nodded solemnly, processing the metaphor with the seriousness only a 3-year-old could muster. "I have my own switch too?" she asked. "You certainly do," Makayla whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. "And don't you ever, ever let anyone else hold it." The driver turned onto the main highway, the car accelerating smoothly toward the distant glowing horizon of New York City. The skyline ahead was a jagged range of light and ambition, a place where Makayla had built an empire from dust and determination. She leaned back against the seat, watching the city rush to meet them. She was no longer looking for acceptance. She was looking at the future, and for the first time in her life, the view was entirely her own. And that brings us to the end of Makayla's journey in Empire of Dignity. It serves as a powerful reminder that true worth isn't something you are given. It is something you build, brick by brick. I would love to hear your take on the story. Which moment resonated with you the most? Was it her defiance on the stage, or her final conversation with Ethan in the driveway? Please share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Thank you so much for listening and walking this path of resilience with me today. Until we meet again for the next story, remember to never let anyone else hold the switch to your light. Goodbye for now.